One councillor can go to the bathroom.
All right. Oh. Good morning, everyone. Apologies for the slight delay. Getting quorum together and finding my elusive binder. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this meeting of Environment and Climate Protection Committee of Tuesday, the 19th of September. We have quorums, so we will move ahead now. I'd like to go through the consent agenda. First of all, do we have any declarations of interest? Seeing none. Confirmation of minutes, Tuesday, 20th of June, 2017. Carried. Thank you. Communications, unless someone wishes to lift those items. We move on then to item 1, status update. Environment and Climate Protection Committee inquiries and motions for the period ending 12th September 2017. Those received? Thank you. Items 2 and 3 we are going to receive together. They are bound one to the other, and I would like to propose that staff give the two presentations, at which point members might ask questions of staff on either of those two items, and then we would vote on them in their order. So we will be holding those and receiving presentations as well. Item 4, do I need to read those amending motions first, or? Yeah. At some point. Okay. Before approval, we'll have technical amendments to a couple of these items. Item 4 then, 2016 Drinking Water Quality Management System Annual Management Review Report. I know it wished to be held. Councillor Drews and others wish to hold that one, and I believe a brief presentation is planned for that item. Is that right? Yep. Okay. Thank you. Item 5, financial statements for in-house solid waste collection, external audit results 2016. Do we have anyone who wishes to hold that? No. Is that item carried? Carried. All right. Thank you. All right. So returning then to item 2 and 3, I would ask staff who will be presenting on those to come up, please. Still don't have, so do that after. Okay. I do not have any delegations registered to speak to any of these items at the moment, but I would, as our staff are settling in, if anyone of the member of the if any member of the public would like to speak to any of the items that have been held, please register at the desk to do so. All right, who will be leading off? Is that you, Mr. Gontier? First, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe if you allow me we'll just switch the presentation. Just a minute of intro that I wanted to highlight. In front of you, basically, we have both finance and the asset management team within Infrastructure Services. Isabel Jasmine to my left. Kelly Martin to my right, and also to his right is Shelley McDonald. And I would like to highlight basically both Shelley and Kelly, and also some of the members of the team for the hard work that they've done, including Patrick Brisson, in terms of bringing us this report forward. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is Kelly Martin, who's been with the city for 30 years. Will be retiring later this year, so this is his last asset management report. It's also his last LRFP that he's worked on, and Kelly's actually worked on every single LRFP that the city has had over the years. So we're presenting LRFP 5. You can certainly count the numbers in terms of what that means in terms of contributions that Kelly has brought to this organization in terms of providing stability in terms of our assets, but also in terms of the finance needed to sustain those assets. And at the same time, I want to welcome Shelley McDonald to his right, who is the new manager of asset management within Infrastructure Services. Shelley has taken over the role that Kelly was occupying, and Shelley will be the one that will be leading you through the presentation this morning.
Thank you, Alain. I'm pleased to be here this morning to provide an update on the city's comprehensive asset management program, as we call it on a regular basis, CAM. The city maintains nearly $42 billion in existing infrastructure. Rate-supported assets represent about $21 billion of the total replacement value. This infrastructure is needed to allow the city to deliver to residents, businesses, and visitors with services that are essential to quality of life and economic growth. We sometimes take for granted the ability to turn on our taps and have drinking water. Walking through various areas in the city and able to enjoy the natural beauty provided in part by the stormwater management systems, and the removal of wastewater effortlessly and its treatment before it returns to the Ottawa River. There are many assets that form part of these integrated systems that need to remain reliable, safe, and in a state of good repair, so that our residents can maintain a high quality of life and economic growth. CAM ensures the right intervention on the right asset at the right time, while balancing affordability and risk. This approach is not new. Successive city councils have taken a number of actions to proactively ensure the long-term integrity of the city's infrastructure, beginning in 2002 with the first long-range financial plan, followed by the integrated asset management strategy in 2003, the capital standards review for public works infrastructure in 2004, and the comprehensive asset management program, CAM, in 2012. Councils have taken the necessary steps to ensure they and the public have a deeper understanding of the city's infrastructure needs so proper planning can inform council's investments in maintenance, renewal, and replacement as part of each long-range financial plan and every annual budget. I am proud to share that the City of Ottawa is a municipal leader in asset management practices and long-range financial planning. We have received awards and recognition for the work, including the Canadian Network of Asset Managers Tiro Asset Management Award for excellence in developing and implementing asset management approaches and significant improvement in business performance through the use of asset management tools, techniques, and approaches. In June 2017, Council received an update on the city's CAM program in relation to tax-supported assets, for example, recreation facilities, roads, and sidewalks, to name a few. That report also included the 2017 State of the Asset Report, also known as SOAR, and the Strategic Asset Management Plan, which is also known as a SAMP. The focus of the report presented today is a summary of the management approach specific to the assets supporting drinking water production and distribution, stormwater management, wastewater collection and treatment, as well as recommendations necessary to allow the undertaking of initiatives that will bring needed refinement to the asset financial requirements, timing of the resource needs, and potential non-financial strategies that need to be used to balance with available funding. There is an essential link between the update in June and today, as a systematic approach results in decisions that maximize benefits, reduce risks, and reduce costs, while continuing to provide safe and reliable levels of service to community users in a socially, culturally, environmental, and economically conscious manner. They're applicable to both the tax and the rate-supported assets. I'd like to highlight the progress that has been made specifically for the rate-supported programs. There have been improved infrastructure cost estimates and applied affordability lens to the Infrastructure Master Plan and the Transportation Master Plan. A draft capital project value assessment for project prioritization has been developed. Some of our existing infrastructure standards have been reviewed through the Building Better and Smarter Suburbs initiative. Time was devoted to engage with a cross-section of professionals from across the city and the development community to review some of the city's standards and look for opportunities to align with other municipal standards or look for changes that won't impact service level, but in the future reduce the number of assets within our inventory. The city has participated on a provincial expert panel for the development of an asset management regulation. And finally, as mentioned previously, Council has received the updated State of the Asset Report for 2017 and the first consolidated Strategic Asset Management Plan. What have been our key accomplishments since 2012? We have successfully applied the CAM approach to select and receive Phase 1 federal program funding for the Clean Water and Wastewater Fund. This is a federal program designed to accelerate short-term community investments while supporting the rehabilitation and modernization of drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure, and the planning and design of future facilities and upgrades to existing systems. Through the CWWF, $569.5 million is provided through federal infrastructure funding and up to a further $270 million of provincial funding. This represents approximately a $100 million investment for Ottawa. We have kept pace with the 2012 State of Good Repair strategy for the rate assets, and we successfully launched a transformational project, the Combined Sewage Storage Tunnel. The construction has started on the CSST, a marquee project for the Ottawa River Action Plan to improve the quality of water in the Ottawa River. The CST project is a $232.3 million investment with funding provided by the Government of Canada, Province of Ontario, and the City of Ottawa. City infrastructure assets are safe. Full details on the assets can be found in the 2017 State of the Asset Report. As I mentioned earlier, it was received by Council in June. As the city's inventory of rate-supported assets continues to expand and age, our risk-based approach reduces the impacts to services. Sustained investments are needed to keep pace with deterioration, along with refinement of the future needs and uncertainties, timing of the needs, and potential non-financial strategies. We need to prepare for the wave of renewal needs, sustain the levels of service, and incorporate the requirements based on legislative changes. The city has and will continue to put in place risk-based financial and non-financial frameworks and approaches to manage the way forward. Specifically, we will continue to enhance the CAM program governance and implementation through the capital project value assessments to link investments to service level outcomes, preparing the service-based asset management plans, integrating life cycle costing into asset-based decision-making, and through some data and system improvements. We will document as-is levels of service for core service areas, evaluate asset needs and timing of implementation against the documented and communicated levels of service expectations. We will assess the outcome of Phase 2 of federal funding programs and provincial asset management regulation. We will undertake non-financial strategy assessments and document the benefits of recommendations for consideration, looking at both service and asset rationalization, renewal strategy effectiveness analysis, adjusting the renewal approach, ensuring consistent application of policies affecting the effectiveness of renewal programs, and we'll also take a look at the large diameter water main inspection program and undertake an assessment with a proposed alternative to ensure that there's a successful and a sustainable program. And finally, based on the results, we'll update the strategic asset management plan. Over the last 15 years, the city renewed the sanitary and storm networks in several neighborhoods that had previously experienced flooding. These areas are Sandy Hill, Preston, Glencairn, and Orleans. Since the renewals, none of the neighborhoods have experienced system-wide flooding. The development of SOAR included working sessions and consultation with multiple business lines across each city department. The CAM Steering Committee has representation from all departments and has overseen the development of all CAM initiatives and the LRFP update. The condition of the city's assets has remained relatively stable, in fair to good condition. Some assets remain in poor or very poor condition, but staff are aware of these assets and they are tracked, assessed, and managed on a risk-to-service basis. The city continues to apply recognized asset management practices to maintain the whole range of rate-funded assets in a state of good repair. And the city's foundational asset management practices have been put in place in order to address the next set of challenges in the rehabilitation, renewal, and replacement of the city's infrastructure. As mentioned in the report, the City of Ottawa, like other Canadian cities, experienced tremendous growth over a relatively short period of time, between the 1950s and 1980s. The infrastructure built over that period of time requires thoughtful, targeted investments in renewal, rehabilitation, and replacement in a way that balances service levels, risk, and affordability. The 2 water purification plants, the 5 communal well systems, and for those of you who aren't aware, those are Vars, Carp, Kings Park, Shadow Ridge, and Munster, and those are located outside of the Greenbelt. The various pump stations, elevated tanks, and over 3,000 kilometers of water transmission and distribution piping provide services to a resident each time they turn on their tap. Since 2009, Ottawa has received perfect scores for water quality in the annual inspections done by the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. Investments since the last SOAR report have focused on providing system redundancy and the necessary planning and design works for rehabilitation, growth, and legislative changes at Britannia, the communal well systems, pumping stations, and water mains across the city. The Robert O. Picard Environmental Center, or ROPEC, the city's wastewater treatment plant, the pump stations, and over 2,800 kilometers of sanitary sewers, trunks, collectors, and force main pipes remove the water used in the homes and businesses daily and on demand. Investments on the wastewater side have primarily been focused on rehabilitation and renewal planning, design and construction at ROPEC, lining and renewal of pipes, and pump station growth and renewal requirements. The stormwater systems consist of both natural and physical assets to collect and convey rain and snow melt away safely. There are over 2,700 kilometers of storm collector, trunks, and force mains, numerous pump stations, ponds, storm management structures, outfalls, ditches, and culverts that form part of that system. Extensive water quality testing of the natural environment has taken place, along with 600 to 800 culvert inspections annually, leading to many culvert replacements due to their condition. The city uses an extensive enterprise system to monitor and schedule maintenance activities at the asset level. Staff have the ability to review historical information at the asset level to support their decision-making. For example, investigations to optimize interventions consider the performance, failure modes, and the system requirements. Staff can review the information and adjust the type of maintenance or work that should be completed at that asset, or adjust the frequency, either increase or lengthen the time between the work. Continuous improvement approach reinvests operational savings back into the system. Not all pipes and pumps are the same. Depending on the location or the type of work that the asset performs, supervisors and planners can make changes that will shift staff time to be focused on parts of the system that require a different level of attention. Staff engagement is a key component of the process. A pillar of CAM is maintenance and operations. These professionals that operate and maintain our rate-supported assets have been doing their jobs for a long time. They have tremendous experience to ensure that the assets are functioning to the best of their abilities. Tapping into their knowledge and experience is a key to ensure that the right intervention on the right assets happens at the right time. A risk-based approach is used to establish inspection frequencies, and the information gathered from the inspections is used to support the prioritization and coordination needs for the buried assets. The large diameter water main inspection program is comprised of 230 kilometers of water main that are 610 millimeters, or about 2 feet in diameter or larger. These pipes typically transport the water from the 2 purification plants across the city to the reservoirs and pump stations that are in the local neighborhoods. The reinspection cycle is relatively long compared to other buried assets. Based on the inspections that have been completed since the program was launched in 2012, the reinspection frequency would be every 35 years, while the reinspection frequency for a similar critical asset on the wastewater system is between 2 and 10 years. Hydraulic modeling to determine how growth will be accommodated is reported through the infrastructure master plans, one for water and one for wastewater. The hydraulic modeling helps to determine the capacity of the existing systems to accommodate additional properties to be connected. The Long-Range Financial Plan 5 for water, wastewater, and stormwater assets has identified current requirements representing an average of $310 million per year in 2017 dollars, which includes the renewal, growth, and strategic initiatives. The net city rate capital investment required is on average $260 million per year, again in 2017 dollars, once external revenue sources, including but not limited to development charges, are removed. This investment rate provides for the capital reinvestment needs identified over the course of 2016 and 2017 for the current 10-year forecast. The initiatives recommended in this report will help further refine the requirements and any funding gap that is required to be addressed. The rate structure approved by Council provides more predictable and stable funding for the assets over the longer term. Staff are recommending to undertake these initiatives by 2020, continuing to enhance the CAM program governance and implementations, document the as-is level of service for core service areas, evaluate the asset needs and timing of implementation against the documented and communicated levels of service expectations, assess the outcome of Phase 2 of federal funding programs and the provincial asset management regulation, undertake a strategy assessment, and document the benefits and recommendations for consideration, including a review of the large diameter water main inspection program to ensure a successful and sustainable program. And finally, based on these results, update the strategic asset management plans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will move directly into the next presentation then. The Long-Range Financial Plan 5, water, wastewater, and stormwater supported programs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next one. So the Long-Range Financial Plan for Water, Wastewater, and Stormwater is the 5th since amalgamation and is the 3rd and final long-range financial plan in a series of plans prepared during this term of Council, which includes the Transit LRFP and the LRFP for tax-supported programs. The LRFP 5, presented to Council in 2012, provided a funding plan that would provide $2.1 billion in capital funding over a 10-year period, increasing the funding amount each year to a target of $240 million per year from its own revenues, with an additional $40 million from development charges and other revenues. To achieve this target, revenue increases were projected for the next 10 years, starting at 6 to 7% in the first 5 years and 5% in the last 5 years, for an average rate increase of 5.7% over 10 years. Staff have implemented those rate increases each year per Council approval as part of the annual budgeting process. The 2012 plan had assumed that water consumption would remain consistent over those 10 years. However, there was a reduction in per capita water consumption over the past 4 years, dropping from 87 million cubic meters to 81 million in 2013 to 2015. Consumption increased in 2016 due to a drought and then dropped below normal levels in 2017 due to higher than projected rainfall. To be conservative, staff have assumed the 2015 consumption levels to develop the forecast and the plan for the next 10 years. The net capital requirement for the past 4 years has also been higher than planned to maintain assets in a state of good repair. Additional debt was used to fund the increased capital investment and offset the lower than planned revenue. Debt servicing levels, however, were maintained within affordable levels below the 15% limit approved by Council. Since the rate-supported programs are fully funded by rate revenues, the long-range plan includes a forecast for both operating and capital costs for the next 10 years. Throughout this presentation, we focus only on the capital investment requirement, but it is important to note that the funding plan was developed considering overall expenditure requirements. Capital investment requirements include asset renewal, growth projects, and strategic initiatives, and projects from regulatory requirements. In 2012, the ask for rate-supported capital investment for renewal, growth, and strategic initiatives was $2.8 billion over 10 years, which is $3.1 billion in 2017 dollars. The revised estimates remain at that same level, which is $3.1 billion over 10 years, or $310 million on average per year. Capital works and operating costs are funded on a cost recovery basis from the fees charged to users of the city's water, wastewater, and stormwater services. Growth-related projects are also funded from development charges collected from new development. Senior government funding may also be received in relation to specific approved projects. Throughout this presentation, I will be referring to the net requirement, which does not include external sources of funding from development charges and other levels of government. It is the amount that must be funded from rate revenues and from debt. Therefore, the gross requirement is $3.1 billion, but the net requirement that must come from rate revenues and debt funding is $2.6 billion. Okay. As mentioned earlier, the average revenue increase proposed in the previous LRFP was 5.7% over 10 years. The average forecast increase is now 4.8%. Increases are slightly higher than originally forecast for 2018 and 2019, being above 5%, but then decrease over time below 5 to 4.2% in 2027. This reflects the need to catch up slightly from the previous year's revenue shortfalls and to match the capital investment requirements in the next few years, which I will describe in more detail later. These revenue increases are smoothed over the period so that there is some predictability for the public on the expected rate increases from one year to the next. In previous years, the rate increases were consolidated into one overall rate increase for water and sewer services. Council approved a new rate structure last year that would take effect in 2018 when the new water billing system is implemented. The new rate structure approved by Council in 2016 provides much greater flexibility to match increases to the specific service and the fixed and variable components of the rate. Individual rate increases will be established each year as part of the budgeting process, using the overall revenue requirements established by the LRFP as a target. The overall revenue target is set to increase by a certain percentage, but the actual rate increases will depend on forecast consumption, number of water accounts, number of properties for the stormwater fee, and assessment values. In comparison to other municipalities, Ottawa's rates are below the median. Toronto increased its water and wastewater rates by 8% and York by 9%. Because stormwater is a small cost compared to the other two services, the 13% increase in 2018 in dollar terms is quite low. For the average rural resident, it represents an increase of roughly $3.50 per year. The funding strategy used for the long-range plan is based on 4 key principles: not to exceed the 15% debt servicing as a percentage of revenues, use longer debt financing terms to reduce the cost annually to within affordable envelopes, to match the life of the asset, and most importantly, to ensure that future generations that will benefit from the asset pay for it, not just today's taxpayers. Maintain capital reserves of at least $60 million to manage fluctuations in operating cost revenues. This amount was established based on a risk assessment of each of the water, wastewater, and stormwater services and financial trends. Rate increases will be smoothed over the 10 years to ensure greater predictability for consumers. The net capital investment required is $2.6 billion over 10 years, which equates to roughly $260 million per year. However, current funding is $196 million per year. Staff have developed a plan that will fund the entire $2.6 billion over 10 years, but that will require higher rate increases in the early years, declining over time, and some additional debt in the early years, but within the 15% limit. The City has and will continue to put in place risk-based financial and non-financial strategies to manage the timing of these investments while ensuring service levels are met and assets are maintained in a state of good repair. This graph provides a good overview of the funding plan. The ask for capital investment in the first few years is higher than current funding levels. Therefore, to smooth out the impact on water, wastewater, and stormwater rates and maintain debt within affordable levels, the capital investment must also be smoothed out. Based on this plan, full funding is achieved in 2023 and thereafter continues to increase at a slower rate to fund investments that would have been pushed out to later years, again while maintaining service levels in a state of good repair. Based on this plan, the full $2.6 billion is funded over a 10-year period. As mentioned earlier, debt is issued in the early years to help alleviate the pressure for high rate increases. Debt servicing peaks at 14.9% in 2021 and 14.8% in 2026. This level is still within the 15% debt servicing limit approved by Council and is actually very reasonable considering the asset-intensive nature of these services. As a case in point, in a 2014 survey was published by the National Association of Clean Water Agencies related to opportunities and challenges in clean water utility financing and management. This survey showed that in 2013, debt servicing represented 26% of utility expenditures in the U.S. Overall, this capital investment plan is very much aligned with the City's affordability principles, industry standard, and meets the overall capital investment requirements over the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. It's the end of the presentation. All right, so I've started a speakers list from people who've come to ask to be on it. I'd ask both Vice Chair Shirelli is first on that list, but there is also a motion to be an amendment to be read onto the record as well to start. If you could open with that, please.
All right. So it's this one. Okay. It is moved by myself, whereas Report AACS 2017-CSD-FIN-0023 includes numerous tables to highlight financial information, and whereas errors have been discovered in Table 11, wastewater, on page 18 of the report, and whereas errors have been discovered in Table 13, total rates supported, on page 18 of the report, therefore be it resolved to correct the errors noted above, the Environment and Climate Protection Committee approve the substitution of the original Table 11 and Table 13 of the report with the following revised tables. And I guess I'm not supposed to read out the tables, right?
Not required to read out the tables. Sure. Okay.
Are we sure that there's not also a mistake on table 12, or there's no mistake on table 12? Just table 11 and 13?
Not if they jump straight from 11
No, you're
to
probably
13.
right. It's probably just 11 and 13. I was just confirming that there's no mistake on table 12.
Okay, did we check? Let's just do this.
Having a nod from Isabel Jasmine there.
Those were the only tables, and it was very minor. Instead of 5%, it was 4%, and so we changed it back to 5%, and then the dollar values, and it changed the total. So each year there was a $10 million difference in the revenues, but it didn't change the overall model. It was just a transposition error.
All right.
So is that carried? Without?
We would vote on that when we come to voting on the motions themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't have to do this one yet. Okay. So do I move to questions? Okay, good. All right, dealing with the principle, without going to any specific tables right now, with the principle that you discussed of bringing in debentures that are the length of the anticipated life of the various capital assets. How does that differ from what we do right now? And I don't mean refinancing, I mean the original issuing of debentures.
It doesn't. It's actually consistent with what we're doing in all the other areas.
Okay, and what would the options be to doing that?
So the maximum we could issue debentures for is 40 years. These are very long-lived assets, so we try as much typically we're around the 30-year mark, but we could issue as much as 40-year debentures.
Okay. And what's the impact by lengthening the debenture, say by 10 years? The impact on the annual charge to ratepayers?
So it would increase the amount of interest that we're paying. It would increase the principal. Obviously, we're paying it over a longer period of time. And so what's happening is that it makes it more affordable on an annual basis. It reduces the annual amount, but it would increase the amount of interest.
So it's going to be the same as a mortgage, right? So if you could get an amortization of 40 years, you'd have pretty low payments, but you're still paying way more money by the end of it.
Overall, but it also matches the life of the asset and who pays for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know back in Nepean, we used to hear this every day on television at Ottawa City Council meetings, and we used to make fun of it, but I won't comment on that. Actually, I think I just did. On page 7, as we look at the comparison of the LRFP 2012 forecast to the actuals, we go year 2012, 13, 14, 2015, 2016, and we see the revenue shortfall of 10.3 million one year, 28.2 million the next, 32.3 million the next, 40.7 million the next, 36.1 million the next. At what point in that series of years would it be fair to say that we were deliberately under budgeting?
So this is comparison to the 2012 plan.
Mm-hmm.
Year over year, as we were budgeting, we've adjusted the budget. So this doesn't reflect the actual budget numbers. We were reducing the budget compared to plan. So the actual budgeted revenue was lower than what was in the 2012 plan.
I think that's here. Wait,
no, so what's here is actually the actuals compared to the 2012 plan.
But when we reduced, we still had we wouldn't be here unless when we reduced, we still had large deficits in most years, right?
Correct. So each year when we budget based on forecasted consumption, what we think the revenue will be for that year, and then we have to also then adjust the expenditures too. So we have to have a balanced budget.
The thing is, I don't believe that every year you were that far off in your forecasting. So at what point did your forecast simply not get adopted by council, and did council just maybe increase the contribution, but by not enough to meet what your forecast was? Because I don't think you were stuck with a $30 million deficit one year and then completely blew the estimate the next year.
That's not what this chart is trying to...
No, I know it's not this chart,
No.
but I mean, year by year, as we brought in deficits each year on water, what I'm trying to get at is how much were we under budgeting, and as compared to what you guys thought the number was going to be.
So over the past 4 years, we've been adjusting the budget to match consumption rates.
Mm-hmm.
We had gone from 87 million cubic meters, that was in 2012, and then each year we adjusted the revenue budgets based on past trends. That's 87 million was still in that, so we were probably over forecasting in those early years. And in 2016, we adjusted it to the trend over the last 3 years, which is at that lowest level, the 81 million.
Okay, but just as an example, 2014, when you brought your estimate to finance staff, did we adopt a budget that matched your estimate?
Yes.
We did?
Yes.
Okay, so each year you were actually off by that much?
In terms of the actual results compared to what was, but yes. Yes.
Okay.
So actual results would have been different than what was forecast in the budget.
Now, part of our issue appears to be that we have presented the impression to the public that the cost of water is proportional to the amount used, when in fact, it looks like over 90% of it is fixed. So, then the public, when they reduce their consumption, because they bought into this impression, you're charging by consumption rates, that therefore they will be expecting some sort of reduction. But since it is fixed, basically, the cost of water is fixed whether you consume a glass of it a year or several swimming pools of it a year. What is the sense of having water rates and not including them in the tax rate? Other than promoting conservation, which I think we are able to do just by asking people to conserve, because apparently they do that when we just ask. But what's the sense of that?
It's a service based on usage, and
but the cost isn't based on usage.
And it's based on a cost recovery model. Pricing for a service should be aligned with the usages of that service, so that the consumer actually has some control over their invoice.
Well, okay, 90% of what we do as a government is a service, and some consume a lot of it, some consume less of it. I'm just wondering, is to justify the apparatus to collect on an individual usage basis when the cost has almost no relationship to the amount that a person uses, how do we justify that cost apparatus?
The expenditures, if, for example, consumption goes down over time, we need to adjust our costs to match. It's not to say that we're going to recover our costs no matter what they are. And so there is a balance between usage and what it costs to deliver those services. That's why it's based on a cost recovery model. You want to be able to match that. and over time, consumption has gone down because of more efficient appliances. So we need to
No, I know
adjust
that, I know
our
that, but what I'm
operations
saying
to-
is, if people cut their use of water in half, it would cost us basically the same. It wouldn't cost us half. It would cost us basically the same. So why do we set up a whole billing apparatus to go after each individual person in the city when we could collect the same amount of revenue just by putting it on the tax rate? And how do we justify spending that money on the actual billing apparatus?
Councillor, your time is up, but I do also want to remind you that we did have this discussion last year as part of our rate review in great degree, and
but now
came
we're
up with
having
the
it for
systems.
the next 5 years.
Well, we are now setting the financial planning
Right.
forecast, but the way in which we approach our rates and the logic behind it was the basis of a long and involved process that very recently concluded.
Yeah, which was tagged to the previous LRFP, so I'm not letting you get in circles where we never ever get to discuss it. So, anyway, she still gets to answer. Okay.
So if it had been on the tax, we wouldn't be adjusting expenditures to match the consumption. There's a direct relationship between the revenue and the consumption of that service and what it costs to deliver it. And if we're putting in more efficient appliances and that consumption goes down, we need to match the expenditures to deliver that service. We have to be more efficient also in terms of the delivery of that service.
So we match it by
So if it
raising
was on the
rates.
tax, it would have just continued to ride at a certain level. And we did explain all of this in the rate review. There was some key principles around the rate itself. Conservation was a big one, accountability, equity, and that rate structure matches those principles specifically.
Thank you. Yes, and that is an important point. We as a committee and then council set the principles, the values and the principles, and well, we attempted to rank them, but weren't that successful with that. We gave you a batch of them to try to guide our rate review process. All right, next on the list is Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to everyone and to staff. Thank you for the plan before us and your critical review and oversight in a very important key piece of the city's infrastructure. Number of questions. First of all, do you work collaboratively with independent professionals who can provide an independent overview or analysis of the infrastructure in the city, what the needs are? Are you getting like a second opinion before you come and present this detailed plan?
Mr. Chair, we have a number of professionals that do provide oversight in terms of all the plans that we put together. When you look at the individual component parts, when it comes to the assessment process, we also have a number of professionals that are involved in providing their professional and unbiased opinion. So all of the information that's being presented to you has had a number of different sets of eyes to be able to rationalize and support basically the numbers that are being put in front of you.
When you establish this plan over 10 years, are you basically triaging the most critical needs that you believe will come up each and every year? Or are these funds going towards the most critical needs within the system?
The short answer is yes. And if you go back to 2012, where we started to really focus on a risk-based approach to how we manage assets, it was a recognition then that we needed to ensure that basically we had our eye on assets that were more critical, higher risk or impacts of service, and those needed attention. Now, that being said, we don't wait for assets to fail or to reach failure to maintain them. So I would say that a lot of our assets we maintain and to be in a state of good repair, so that we don't wait for them to be at the point of breaking. And that's an important premise of a risk-based approach.
You mentioned in your report the 310 million per year goes towards renewal of assets, growth, and SIs. What strategic initiatives are not growth related and not renewal related? Can you just give me one or two key examples?
maybe, Chair, if we can get a few minutes, we can come back with that one.
Can I ask my next question, or do you need time?
No, you can move on to the next, and we'll
Okay.
come back with an answer.
My next question is about the formula you use, the revenue formula. So in order to get to the 310 million you calculate the existing revenues that come in, you calculate the amount of debt that you want to incur, and then you have to look at what the rate increases will be to balance that all out. I'm concerned about the rate increase. So we can, I think, fairly accurately estimate, well, we've brought in X number of revenues over the past few years. We're looking at the trends of consumption. We can figure out revenues. Do the rate increases, is there a direct relationship between the amount of debt you're able to incur, there's a ceiling to that, and then ultimately the rest goes to the rate increase? Or how are you trying to have a balance, a reasonable balance with that rate increase? I'm seeing increases now over 5%. Alarm bells are going off. So I want to have a better understanding of the relationship between incurring debt and the actual rate increase.
The revenue pays for debt servicing. And as you increase your debt servicing would also increase. So we're trying to balance between that. Also, we're doing this in the early years because interest rates are very low. Let's say, for example, interest rates climbed, well, then we'd have to rebalance. The interest costs wouldn't be as affordable, and then we'd have to increase rates even more so and balance it back towards the rate side. Right now, it's an opportune time to issue debt because the interest rates are so low. So there is a balance between the two, and we are maintaining the debt within that 15% threshold. But as I mentioned in my presentation, in the utilities area, it actually goes above that. It goes up to 26%.
Did you look at having a rate increase at 5% or less over the 10-year? Because in the last 5 years, it's well below 5%. In the first 5 years, you're averaging above 5. There's I don't know about other members. I mean, people understand the need for infrastructure renewal. No one's really pushing back on that, but it is expensive, and perpetual 5 to 6% rate increases with no end in sight, I think, is a concern for many. And we know my very first briefing at boot camp, my understanding was there was a finite period of 5 to 6% rate increases. We're dealing with critical projects. There would be an end to that at some point. And now we're looking at another 10-year period with the same, basically, percentage increases with no end in sight. Are we perpetually, every 10 years, I think you're going to come back to us, here are the next round of infrastructure projects. They're not part of the budget per se, and we're going to need people, taxpayers, to continuously pay 5 to 6% rate increases forever. At what point do we get a better handle on the rate increases so they're more reasonable? 5.7% or 5.6%, that's almost 3 times higher than what sort of our budget cap has been with the rates. And it's difficult to argue against the need for infrastructure renewal because I'm not doing that. I'm just trying to have a better understanding. When you look at revenues plus debt, you are left with, well, what's left? Well, the rate increases. And I think that's becoming more difficult for some residents to pay year after year. So is there any way to still deliver what needs to be delivered, but refine that rate increase over the 10 years so that it doesn't exceed 5%?
The way the model is today, we'd have to go above that 15% threshold.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I do have a significant number of more questions. Just put me back on the list. But I'm going to stop at this point.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, if I can just follow up on the councillor's question. There were a couple of significant strategic priorities which were part of council's priorities were the large diameter inspection program, which was part of council's priorities, and also the stormwater retrofit program, also part of council's priorities.
Thank you. Yes, you're back on the list, and Councillor Shirley, I believe, is already back on. Councillor Egley.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of questions. You had talked about a $3.50 increase. Now, the area that I represent is neither fish nor fowl. So we're urban, but I have a number of communities that are privately serviced. And we'd had a long discussion about this last year. And in fact, one of my communities forward with a number of suggestions for change, which were incorporated. We didn't really get into the dollar pieces at that point. So can you give me a sense for those communities, because they're not paying the full amount and they're not paying the rural rate. So if we go to table 12, for example, what increases are they looking at in real dollars over the next, I think the table goes out to 2027. So what numbers are they looking at in real dollars increase-wise?
So in the urban areas that aren't connected, they received a 30% discount versus rural areas that received a 50% discount. 100% rate. So the amount I'm quoting is the phased-in amount. So next year they're only paying 50%. It's a phased-in amount, and they would be paying an extra $4.30-ish per year. Once it's 100% phased in, that would be an additional. That would equate to an additional $8 per year.
So
for the year.
By 2027, they'd be paying an additional $8 a year. Is what you?
By 2027, if you've added multiple 13% over and over, I'd have to go back and calculate that, but it was in the 10th year. Pardon?
If they're paying around $75 an hour, they need around $200.
So an additional $200 a year is what those people in that, again, in that middle ground, the urbans, but who are self-service, that's what they'd be paying at the end of the day.
So if they're paying $75 now, they wouldn't be paying.
I guess what I'm asking, what I'd like to know before I can't vote today, I don't sit on committee, but before I do vote, I want to know what the actual numbers are. Okay. Percentages are one thing, and that's yes. Great, but I want to know what the actual dollar amounts are as well that my residents will be paying that are in that area, that are again urban but self-serviced.
If I can just clarify, what we're presenting today is revenue increases that we need. This is a key element for our budgeting process, and it's in the budgeting process that we actually determine the rate increases. And I was explaining in my presentation that the rate is actually developed based on forecasts for consumption, number of residences, properties. So for stormwater, for example, it's divided by the number of properties. If the number of properties increase over time, the amount shared is also decreased. So every year we look at, well, we need an extra 13% in revenue, but we have an extra 10,000 households. Well, then the denominator helps to reduce that. So it wouldn't, 13% is the amount of revenue, additional revenue we need. It doesn't reflect the actual rate increase. There's a separate calculation that we have to do as part of the budgeting process to figure out what that is. I can't tell you 10 years from now how many properties we'll be sharing in the cost of the stormwater. That would be
no, I understand that, but this report obviously, if approved, is a tool that you're going to use in order to determine what that dollar amount is for people. So maybe what you can do then, before this does get to council for vote, if you can tell me if we froze the population today, the number of houses today, what would those people be paying in 2027 additionally per year? And I guess on the answer you've just given me, that would be the worst case scenario, assuming that the population of the city doesn't go down, which I think we all agree is unlikely. So if you could freeze the population and say if we still had the same number of houses in 2027, this is what in real dollars people would be paying in that category, I would appreciate that. The other is to build on Councillor Shirelli's suggestion or question and I don't often like to do that, but I thought he raised an interesting idea. So he said if you took your debenture and you added 10 years onto it, so if we did that, and again, assuming population or residence number is frozen, what does that do to the 13% number that we keep seeing in Table 12? If we made the payment over an additional 10 years?
Help to reduce it.
So that would reduce it, and population growth would reduce it.
Correct.
So again, so 13%, what you're saying to us today without being able to give us a number, the 13% is the worst case scenario that you can see over the next 10 years. If you were to adopt Councillor Shirelli's model, then you, and again, assuming no population or residence change, that 13% figure would go down.
Correct.
Can you give us any sense of what it might go down by?
We'll figure that out and get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Gley. It is now Councillor Leeper.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll continue the line of conversation that Councillor Shirelli and Eagle have been looking at. So I just want to confirm, when I take a look at the actuals versus forecast, or the actuals versus the plan numbers in the previous period, our revenue was off by about 9.6%, and the expenses were up by about 8.7%. Is that roughly correct? We brought in, almost 10% less revenue than we had expected in the plan. We spent about 8.5% more in expenses than we had planned.
Apologies, if you could repeat the question.
Just first confirmation, Deputy Treasurer. In the previous plan, it looks like we received about, almost 10%, roughly 9.6% less revenue than we had planned over the period. When you take a look at plan versus actuals, expenses were 8.7% or so higher than plan when we look at the actuals. So that's the rough number there. One of the things that we've chatted about this morning is, and I want to confirm something that you told Councillor Shirelli. It looks to me in this plan like we're making a change to have longer-term debt. I thought I heard you say to Councillor Shirelli, though, that is simply consistent with what, the previous debt periods that we've done. Are we making a change? We're making a conscious change to extend the debt periods for the various different borrowings that we do?
To date, we have 30-year.
Okay.
The previous plan had the same principle. We're not changing
okay.
The principle. It's exactly the same as it was in 2012.
So extending or having a longer debt term does imply that we're going to pay higher interest costs overall, even if the amount is lower each year. Do you have any scenarios for what changing the borrowing period might be in terms of the total interest costs in any given debenture? So if we were to borrow at 20 years instead of 30, 40 years instead of 30, what would be the implication for the total interest costs that we're paying?
So if you compare a 30-year to a 20-year, you're paying 1/3 less interest.
Sorry, just one more time.
So instead, a 30-year
Yep.
versus a 20-year, 10-year versus you're paying 1/3 more in terms of interest.
Right. So it's going that decision or that approach we have long term is actually costing us more in interest charges overall, which has a long term implication for the next generations. The debt servicing costs are projected to average 14% over this period. If our forecasts are out by that same magnitude, if the planned revenue is, again, say 10% less than we plan, and if our expenses are, again, 9% higher than we thought we would, What does that mean for our ability to maintain the debt servicing costs at under 15%? I'm concerned that we're cutting it close. If the same magnitude of forecast anomaly were present in that next period, would we be able to maintain that sub 15% interest cost ratio?
Even over the past 4 years, we've seen those fluctuations in revenue, and the estimates that we have now are based on the much more conservative forecast in terms of consumption. So we're using the 2015 consumption to forecast out over the next 10 years, and that was the lowest point that we have been. So we're very conservative in the overall forecast. And what we've been doing every year as part of the budgeting process is looking at where are we trending, this is a 10-year plan. Be updated every term of council based on new information. So we're constantly updating this plan. What we do on a budgeting every year is based on revenues, expected revenues, and then also expenditures. So there's an adjustment made each year. Then we build in the debt servicing. So when you look back at the 2012 plan, we were estimating we'd be around 10.2% of debt servicing, and based on choices we've made each year as part of the budgeting process, we're closer to 12.7.
Right.
So but we're still below the 15%. There could be a point where we reach the 15%, but those are decisions that we have to make in terms of what are we willing to invest. It's a budget decision.
And I think that's an interesting question. I mean, we're beginning to bump against that ceiling. Going from 10% expected debt servicing cost to 12 is obviously not insignificant. We're now forecasting that we'll be somewhere around that 14%. That doesn't leave us a lot of wriggle room in terms of trying to stay within that cap. What are the various different options that we have in order to stay underneath that? And would that include dipping into reserves in order to accomplish projects that we felt were critical? Or are we looking at much higher rate increases down the road if we have the same magnitude of error with respect to the plan versus actuals?
We have those flexibilities. Sorry, what's the question?
You know, it's the change in the terms of plan versus actuals was 10%, or call it 9% in each one of those categories. And I'm just trying to understand if that same magnitude of actuals versus planned were experienced over the period of the next plan, does that put us over 15%? And then in order to get back under that 15%, could we do that out of reserves instead of rates? I'm trying to understand the wriggle room that we have to work with here.
Okay, so we built into the forecast a lot of conservative estimates. We have built in building up the reserves up to $60 million, so there is flexibility for year-over-year fluctuations. We were very conservative in our consumption assumptions, water consumption assumptions, and we were also very conservative in terms of our interest rates. We're using 5% interest rates, so all of it is built with a lot of flex in it.
Okay, and it is you're explicitly saying that it's a more conservative forecast than the previous plan was.
I would say so.
Okay. I'll be interested to hear the continued discussion with Councillor Chiarelli. It continues to strike me. I think I asked you, or I asked the Treasurer in the process which led up to the creation of the new rate structure, how much of the cost of water particularly is fixed, and I was told it's 90%. Whether or not you actually use any water, 90% of the cost of it is fixed, just to have the pipe to your house and the ability to get clean water. It does strike me as a disconnect that we charge largely on the basis of consumption for something that costs us the same whether you use it or not. So I think Councillor Chiarelli will continue that line of questioning. I'm curious to hear that conversation. No, that's it. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. I'm loath to rule question out of order when they are still on the topic, but I do want to again remind Councillor Leeper and Chiarelli that this was precisely what we did just debate over an extended period, which was how much of the rate would be apportioned to a fixed charge and how much would be a moving or a floating rate, and that was precisely the nature of a long discussion we had. You're welcome, I suppose, to ask the question again, but this was a decision that Council very recently made as policy, and it's what staff is implementing. Councillor Moffat.
Thank you. Just looking at, I think there's a couple reports in the history on this, pretty important. So the report from last year that has been mentioned today, somewhat important because that sets out how we collect these fees for the foreseeable future. Then also, that report was predicated on the previous long-range financial plan, which was long-range financial plan 4. So if I'm not mistaken, the number that we used to calculate the stormwater rates was $42 million annually, right? Correct? Right. So in the report from last year, the water rate structure review, the report speaks to the long-range financial plans over the years since 2002, and that the city has taken a proactive approach in ensuring that our infrastructure is up to speed and that we're investing appropriately in this infrastructure. So when we calculated that rate and we said $42 million is what we're spending, how did we get to a point that within the next 10 years that goes from $42 million budgeted in 2016 to $135 million in 2027? That seems like a significant increase in that budget when apparently we've been managing that budget over the last 15 years.
Just a slight correction, Mr. Chair. In the water rate review, we had based the amount on that 2015 and 2016 budgeted amount. It wasn't based on the 2012 plan or forecast
2016
spending.
Operating budget is $42.2 million. It says that right in the report.
Pardon?
2016 operating budget is $42.2 million.
Yes,
right
it was based on the budget, exactly, not on the 2012 LRFP planned spending. Maybe I misunderstood. It was based on the 2016 budget, what we were actually spending or budgeted for stormwater in 2016.
The need to do that review was identified in 2008 by the Auditor General at the time. And Council directed staff, I think, to undertake this. Before my time, so apologies for not knowing it fully, but 2009, 2010, I believe there was discussion around reviewing the rate structure at that time. We did an LRFP in 2012, and we didn't review it, the rate structure, until just, well, the last couple of years. Knowing that we were going to be doing an LRFP this year, which has clearly given us different information, and we set the rate structure based on a number that's significantly lower than what we need to collect over the next 10 years, why didn't we wait to do the rate structure review until after we did LRFP 5?
The intent of the rate structure was to redistribute who pays for what. It was based on the current rates. When we talk about what is funded for stormwater, it's 196 million versus the average of 260 million that so when we talk about the long-range financial plan and what the requirements are, they're higher than what we're currently funding. The rate structure was based on what we're currently funding, based on the 2016 budget, reallocating that to 3 separate services: water, wastewater, and storm. But it was based on the current, not the plan needs. And then we're going to follow up with that with a long-range financial plan to understand what the requirements were going forward. So they were 2 separate exercises.
So this time last year, you knew that you were going to do a long-range financial plan, right?
Yes.
So in the report, when we projected the phase-in period of the stormwater rate, and we projected that phase-in at 4 years, and we said what we thought that rate would be over the next 4 years, and that would be $15 first year on let's say the rural side. It impacts urban as well. Everyone in this city will pay a stormwater fee. Why didn't we tell them or put in the report that we're phasing this in. It's likely going to be this number, but it's really not going to be that number because we haven't done a long-range financial plan yet, and that number is actually going to be quite significantly higher. I realize that by dollars, you don't agree that it's significant because we've talked about that before. Percentages-wise, though, it is significant, and 13% is significant. And now I know you've also said to Councillor Eglai that the 13% is just on the revenue, not the tax. But that's not in here. I mean, in your LRFP from 5 years ago, you specifically said in that LRFP that the impact on the water and sewer rate would be 7% in the first few years, then 6%, then 5%. That's proved to be fairly accurate. So what's there to tell me that the 13% isn't going to be directly reflected in the rate in the future? I mean, I have to vote on this now. I don't have the ability to say, well, it's probably going to be okay.
So the last increases, the last LRFP was a blended number for all services, and it was based on the old rate structure. So it was consistent year over year. The increase matched what the rate increases were. Now we've created a new rate structure with a fixed component, volumetric component. Stormwater is based on a tiered rate model. There's a lot of moving parts in that rate to make it more equitable. And so it's not a one-to-one relationship now between that percentage increase and the amount that's being shown in the amount that we actually increase each rate. The rates are calculated much more precisely aligned with those specific services. So it's very different. It was a combined rate before for all services. Now it's very specific to each service.
So knowing how important that report was a year ago to certain members of council and how contentious creating that fee structure was for certain members of council and for certain residents in the city, and knowing that this report that you made public last Tuesday and gave us a heads up the day after, knowing that report was recommending a 270% increase in the stormwater budget, at what point was the decision made to not consult with members of council before making the report live?
There was no decision not to consult. It was part of the long-range financial planning exercise. It was based on the requirements that are there. This is a recommendation based on forecasted needs. It's consistent with what other municipalities are implementing. We've always talked about stormwater and the requirements in those areas. There was never a commitment not to increase those rates. Should we have considered?
Yeah, because I would love to have not found out that the budget was going up by 270% because somebody visited my booth at the Richmond Fair this weekend. I would have loved to have found out from someone else because I know other people knew. I know the chair of the committee knew. I know that you knew that this report was recommending a 270% increase in the stormwater budget, but yet no one felt the need to tell members of council. It's just absolutely puzzling. My wrap-up was saying it's puzzling, so I'm good.
All right. I will choose to speak then and ask my questions as chair. I will take some responsibility for that, as our staff has outlined. This was a process that they are required to go through. The long-range financial planning was an exercise that we specifically have directed them to go through. And I think we have to be very careful with numbers. To say 270% increase is 10 years from now. We can come up with, yes, you did, but it's easy to get people, I suppose, excited with the big number that's 10 years away from now. I think it's quite important that we lead people through the
was I being wrong,
annual
though?
exercise.
Was I wrong? Was the Does the report not project 10 years? Was I not referring to the report and the 270% increase recommended in the report? So was my comment not relevant to the report?
Councillor Moffat, your comment was relevant to the report.
Okay, so I'm not sure how
I am now giving my view that it's important that we look year by year. I know that I can project electricity rates 20 years, 10, 20, or 30 years from now, and the number will appear absolutely monstrous. But that isn't the same as the 2018 number that someone will be paying. So I think that's important that we keep in mind. Also, I'm very sensitive to the fact that we went out to the public and consulted widely. We were at those meetings. They were, in many cases, very contentious. And that we not today, or when we vote on this, in any way be reneging on anything we said. So it is as important to me as I believe it is to Councillor Moffat and DeRuse and others that we not have played a shell game with our residents. I don't believe we have, but I want to be sure of that when we vote on this. I know that staff in their presentations during the rate review made as clear as they could. I certainly did. I heard the question asked and responded to, that what we were doing in that exercise was deciding on how we were going to divide up the pie. The pie was the 2016 budgeted amount. We were deciding how that would be divided up differently and in a more fair way, and other criterion that we chose on how to do that. But we then made as clear as possible, this isn't a fixed number that will not change, but that is not what we are doing today as part of that exercise. That was a rate review, and in the future, and here we are the first year of that future, we will be looking at our actual financial forecasts. So I think that's also important for us to keep in mind, that was, if there is any promise that was made that this report in front of us is reneging on, I would like to know what that is. I have questions. So that was my first. Is there anything in the long-range financial plan before us that contradicts or reneges on what the city told residents and council during that rate review? I ask our staff, is there anything you're aware of that is a change or backtracking?
No.
Okay, thank you. What would happen if council chose, and I know those 270% is over 10 years is true. What would happen if we were to choose not to adopt that long-range financial plan? What would happen if we were to say that number is too big, it looks badly on us, it's a blow to our residents, for us to shrink that? Can you explain what our options might be to not go with the LRFP in front of you, particularly, let's say, on the stormwater side, that is the much bigger number?
Chair, maybe I can start from I guess, the non-financial impacts. The dollars that are put in front of committee are basically the dollars that are required to sustain the infrastructure. And I know that there's been a number of discussions around fixed rates and consumptions. And the councillors are correct that there is a lot of fixed component to the asset. These are very capital intensive services. They're probably the most capital intensive services that we have in the city, and there is funding that's required to sustain them. If we get less revenue, then basically we will have to adjust basically the investment made to match those revenues. And that means basically deferring some of the works that might be planned. Now, all in the context of a risk-based approach. So that suddenly everything is going to be falling apart. We will continue to apply our risk-based approach in terms of prioritizing those investments so that we apply basically the investments to those services that, or the risk that pose a higher risk to service. I think the other option is basically looking at a different transition strategy for the funding. Same quantum of funding, but looking at a different strategy. But if it's a net reduction, then that will have a net effect in terms of what is actually delivered.
But above all, it would be deferring some work, a reprioritization, or perhaps continuing with the same priorities, but projects that are lower on that list would be deferred outwards.
Correct. If there's lower revenues, there will be lower investments made, which means that there's projects or investments that will be deferred.
And I see Mr. Harley in the room. We know that he has and will again remind us that deferring major capital infrastructure projects ultimately costing more down the road. It's not just that it puts it off. It can sometimes be multiples of what it would have cost to have done in a more timely manner. So I guess we're aware of that. I just wanted to be quite clear on the cost of deferral. I will now turn back to our speakers list. I had Shirelli and Brockington wanting to go again, and please let me know if others would as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, when you were answering questions about the revenue increases 10 years from now, 5 years from now, to Councillor Eglis and Councillor Moffat's, could you clarify whether the numbers we were talking were the actual dollars people will pay in those years, or are they 27 years?
So when I was providing the increase in the $3.50, for example, that was what would be the impact next year.
Okay.
Specifically,
but when
just
you're
for 1
talking
year.
5 and 10 years from now, you're talking $2017, or are you talking the actual dollar amount that people will pay 5 and 10 years from now?
I wasn't calculating the 10th year increase. I was calculating just the most immediate.
Okay, your
year.
revenue requirement, though, you're calculating, and that's in $17.
Oh, I see. Those are inflated dollars. The actual revenue dollars that are showing, those are inflated.
So they're not 2017.
Correct.
Okay, good. Then second question. The users of water in the city are not just individuals. They're also businesses and industry. So what is the difference in impact on those entities versus households? And how do you capture that in this report?
They would have the same increases on the water and wastewater side. They have a fixed portion, which is based on meter size, so they have a fixed fee that would go up. Whatever percentage is determined as part of the budgeting process, it will be around the percentages that you see here. And same with the volumetric rate. So there's 4 tiers. Because if they're a high consumer of water, they're paying the highest tier of water rates. And in terms of the stormwater, there's a tiered rate for those based on assessment value. So a business in a range of a certain value or assessment value gets a fixed fee for the year, and again, roughly would increase by the percentages we see here, but then adjusted for the number of businesses and also the changes in assessment value, because each tier is based on a range of assessments. So every year we determine what the new assessment values are based on the previous year's roll. So that's why I'm saying there's a lot of mechanics behind calculating the actual rate. It depends on a lot of moving parts, but this is roughly the increases that you would see.
Yeah, because I just remember when we were dealing with, initially with Orga World, and we were looking at the garbage issue, and we got to very fine calculations, granular calculations about what we could do to get individual residents to do this or that to produce a better outcome. And then somebody mentioned, oh, and by the way, 2/3 of our waste isn't covered by this because it's in the industrial, institutional, and commercial sector, and we're not even doing anything there. So what percentage of our water revenue comes from the corporate sector, institutional or industrial?
So that's one thing that we actually improved as part of the water rate structure. Previously, when water was billed based on consumption and water, sewer, and storm, the industrial sector was paying a disproportionately lower amount of what they should have been paying for stormwater. And so for the stormwater rate, we actually split it. It should be a 60-40 split. It was a 70-30 split before, and so we've actually adjusted that so they're paying their fair share.
Okay. Percentage of our revenue, water revenue, for instance, comes from that sector as opposed to residences?
The 30%.
Okay. And I got an email from somebody a couple days ago who said, I've been looking at the structure and I've been looking at what you're planning, and I've calculated that if I reduce my water to almost no usage, I'm still going to pay more. You guys have made a mistake. So I've written back, obviously, saying, no, it's not a mistake. It's the way the cost of water actually is. But what are we going, like, I don't see the point in trying to sugarcoat it to the public. They should know that they will pay more, and that the whole reason for the rate structure exercise was, or the first main reason was, to get more money out of the public to pay down the deficit that was happening every year. What are you doing to get that message across? Because if we keep getting people calling us or writing us saying, hey, this must have been a miscalculation because I'm still paying more.
First, it wasn't to get more money. It was to stabilize the money. When we developed the rate structure, it was based on collecting the exact same amount of revenue. What we were doing is redistributing and actually stabilizing 20% of it, saying 20% of it will be fixed going forward, and 80% will be volumetric. So it was the same amount of money. It wasn't more money through the rate structure.
Then how's the deficit disappear if you're not bringing in more money?
The deficit would be reduced because of 20% of it. So for example, in a year where we have an $8 million deficit, 20% of that would have been fixed, and so we would have had a 20% less deficit, but we would still have a deficit.
Okay, but everybody knows they're paying more money. They just think it's a mistake. They don't realize it's a plan. Okay. And finally, how much of our renewal requirement is due to the fact that in previous years we didn't put enough into capital renewal, so we now have bigger costs?
Mr. Chair, if you look at successive long-range financial plans, especially on the rate side, we have seen fairly significant rate increases, and a lot of those, and it was consistent message, a lot of them were driven by the capital intensive nature of the service. So we have seen significant increases in investments. We also have seen increases in terms of the renewal need to sustain those infrastructure, those assets. Ms. McDonald in her presentation talked about kind of the age wave in terms of a lot of the infrastructure built in the 50s to 80s. That's the infrastructure that now we're focusing on in terms of renewing, and that's also driving some of the increases. On the stormwater side, stormwater is kind of the newer type of infrastructure. We certainly were building water and sewer infrastructure long before we were building stormwater infrastructure, but that infrastructure now is aging and is also in need of attention. So it's not necessarily just a question of catching up, it's a question of looking forward and seeing what are the investments that are needed to continue to sustain the services that we had. When you look at assets of 93% in fair to very good condition, doesn't signify that it doesn't indicate that basically we've been running our assets to the ground. It indicates that we have been sustaining our assets, which we need to continue as we continue to face some of the pressures of age. And to your earlier point around conservation, I wouldn't want this committee to have the notion that basically conservation is a bad thing, because conservation is not a bad thing. Because we're dealing with such a capital intensive service, the more that we can get from that infrastructure is important. The more that we can defer upgrades and increases to that infrastructure is important, and that has significant financial benefits to the city. So we are projecting continued investments in terms of renewal, because we do have a lot of infrastructure out there that is aging, and we want to make sure that we try to contain basically the amount of infrastructure that we have so that we can continue to sustain it.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I just want to thank him for that answer. Usually, sometimes it's difficult to get staff to answer a question, but he not only answered the question, but he answered the one I didn't ask yet. So now I don't have to ask it.
Thank you. And as we all know, it is difficult to get staff to give us answers that they know we don't want to hear. Councillor Brockington, I wanted to go again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you to staff. You've taken some challenging questions this morning, but you certainly know this file well, and again, appreciate your time on this. Just on a personal note, I don't receive a City of Ottawa water bill. I live in a condo, and they get an aggregate bill, and then we sort it out ourselves based on the volume use. But for bills that are sent out to homeowners and business owners, first, do you have the opportunity to insert a information, what do you call those? Yeah, a circular to describe what's happening as part of an information campaign about, you will see increases and here's why. Here's the direction we're going. Here's the importance of infrastructure. Have we done that in the past? Is that being considered?
Yes, we have been doing this all year. When we went out with the stormwater rate on the tax bill, we went out with a buck slip early in the year, and then with it also, and then we've just recently gone out with another insert.
Good. And will that be maybe an annual thing that we're going to do?
Leading up to the implementation, the new rate structure is implemented in 2018. Leading up to that, there's a whole communication plan to manage that.
Thank you very much. My other question, part of the second report, the Comprehensive Asset Management Program update, you have a figure or a table 1 on page 12. You list a number of departments within the city. You are providing a status of those assets from poor or very poor all the way up to very good. Given that this is a comprehensive assessment program on water and sewer rates, can you talk to me how that is relevant to some of the departments that you list in this table? You list paramedic service, you list the fire department, you list parks and recs. Is that separate? Do I read this table and say, well, we're not just talking about sewer infrastructure, we're talking about all assets that these departments own, and this table specifically about a snapshot on the assets, all assets?
So, Chair, when you look at the Comprehensive Asset Management Program, it speaks to all of the assets that are required to support services. So what you have in terms of the figure 1 are basically all of the assets and the service areas. Ms. McDonald in her presentation made reference to a presentation that was made in June to Committee and Council on the tax side. So at that point, we were focusing on the tax supported type of assets, so paramedic, roads, parks, some of the buildings. So this is kind of part 2 to the presentation on the asset management program. It is a holistic view in terms of the management of our assets, but certainly in front of you, the main focus are water, wastewater, and stormwater.
I think the table is very useful in giving us an accurate idea of the state of those assets, but it's very alarming that there are a number of departments who have poor to very poor assets. The fire department, 49% of their assets are ranked as poor or very poor. Police department, 58% of their assets are rated poor or very poor. How feasible is it for staff to give us a breakdown, not today, but if you could give us a breakdown of what types of assets we're talking about? A walkie-talkie is different than a fire truck. And so that, I think, particularly going into budget time, would help members of this committee and council get a more accurate idea. Bylaw, 72% of assets are in poor or very poor condition, but what assets do bylaw use, for example? I don't know. So how feasible is to get that information?
So, Chair, certainly this is a summary table, but there is a state of the asset report that was distributed back in June. It's also referenced in this report. It provides a more granular breakdown of the assets. Typically, the services that you've highlighted where there tends to be a higher percentage, those tend to be related to fleet assets. And fleet assets tend to have certainly shorter lives. So this is an area where you tend to see more significant changes from reporting period just because you're dealing with assets that have maybe a 7 to 10 year life. As services that are more, and I would caution that these are not necessarily departments, they're more aligned to services that we provide to the public. The ones that are more capital intensive in terms of long-lived assets, you certainly see that they have lower percentages in those poor to very poor. And again, where we do have poor to very poor, we certainly have an awareness of the condition of those assets. We also have an awareness in terms of the importance that they provide in terms of sustaining services.
The report you referenced, was that tabled at FEDCO?
Correct. The state of the asset report was tabled at FEDCO, and I believe it's also a link referenced in this report.
So I'll thumb through that again, but if I wanted to get more detailed information,
we can provide that.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
More? Okay. Councillor Moffat, if there are any others who wanted to go on the list, please indicate. Okay, over to you.
Just prior to amalgamation, stormwater was not with water and sewer. Right? That was the whole point of what we did last year, was that stormwater has no relationship whatsoever with water and sewer. It's more related to roads. Why then are we going to continue to align these three in this report? Because I keep hearing words like consumption. Consumption is irrelevant to stormwater. Most of our stormwater infrastructure is required to support our road network. It's nothing else. Yes, residents use it, but the primary function of stormwater services is to service our road. It has nothing to do with consumption. It has nothing to do with where you flush your toilet. That was something that we made clear a year ago. When we keep it with these other two budgets, we make it okay to increase it by more than 2%. Roads doesn't have the luxury. Road infrastructure is more pivotal than our stormwater infrastructure. It costs more. It costs more to maintain. We have a higher asset level in our road infrastructure than our stormwater infrastructure. And in fact, quite often when we're replacing roads, we're also replacing stormwater. So at what point would it make more sense to shift the stormwater budgets, seeing as we're now collecting it separately? We're not collecting it on the water bill anymore. I mean, it still gets collected there, but it's a separate line item, and the revenue comes in separately. Why don't we shift it back over to roads?
I'd like to speak more to the connection between stormwater and also wastewater and the aquifer. It's all combined as water infrastructure. We looked at putting it on the tax as part of the rate structure. The concern with that, and the reason why there is a stormwater fee is because it should be based on the imperviousness of the property.
Yes, I know all that.
It's
I don't want you to get
that's creating the stormwater, and
I know
that was
everything
the
that we
link.
did last year.
And if it was on the tax, those that are tax exempt would not be paying a stormwater fee. So large.
No, I'm not talking about
hospitals.
it should be on the taxes.
Okay.
I'm saying, why is it still managed alongside these other two when all the discussion ends up being around consumption? Oh, we need to have the rate go up because the consumption goes up. It clouds the issue of stormwater. It justifies massive increases in stormwater because you have it aligned with relatively large increases in water and sewer, which can't be bound by a 2% cap. it's the alignment of the three together is misleading. Anyways, also, because after I spoke, the chair decided to ask a line of questions which seemed directly aimed at my line of questions. When we referred to what we said to residents a year ago, you're right, nowhere in that report did it say that we weren't going to increase it. But you do recall that the most critical people had said to us that the second you remove that rate and isolate that rate and put it on the tax bill as its own, the city will increase it because that's what they do. They'll come back and they'll increase it and they'll double it. I don't know what your response to that was. My response was that it's my job to make sure we don't do that to you. One of the examples I used was the garbage rate, $82 for 4 straight years, $84 this year. So we went up $2 over 5 years. You know, I was using that as an example of how we manage our fees so that we don't just remove it from another rate, charge you something new, and then the second we get an opportunity to raise it, we do. But that's exactly what we're doing. That's exactly what this report does. It creates a new fee that we did last year, and it takes it and it doubles it, more than doubles it. I know you say that that's might not be what happens, but you also can't say that it won't happen. So when we went out to public, it wasn't that we misled anyone. It wasn't that we lied to them. It's that we lacked transparency because we knew that we were going to review this plan. And we must have known that we were underfunding stormwater infrastructure if that's what this report says. Because if you're going to go from $42 million budgeted in 2016 to $135 million budgeted 10 years from now, then you must have known for years that we've been drastically underfunding stormwater infrastructure, so that when we created the rate based on the 2016 budgets, we knew that rate couldn't be at that number, anywhere close to that number, for the next 4 or 5 years, because the money wasn't there. So either we weren't transparent with people and we didn't tell them that it was going to go up, or we created the rate on a number that made no sense, and we didn't allocate enough dollars from water and sewer to create the rate in the first place. A lower rate so that we get a lower, we took a lower budget, so we create a lower rate so we get more buy-in, so we could create the stormwater rates, pass it unanimously, which I take credit for. And then, first chance we get, we come back and we're going to jack it up as much as possible over the next 10 years. Now, again, you're right that it wasn't in the report and that you didn't lie to people, but we certainly didn't tell them the whole story. It lacked transparency. And when the people told me that this is what we were going to do, and I said we weren't going to do this, I was wrong. And this report makes me wrong.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no other, Councillor LaRouche.
I just want to make a comment. I know we've been talking about it all morning, but I will support Councillor Moffat, and that was not brought up to the public, and we did lack on transparency. Yeah, we did a mistake accepting the fact of working with you, and I do believe back there is a motion, I think, between now and council. I'd like you to pull the motion that we pass at council that will not increase the rate in the next 4 years. Maybe there is a deficiency in the wording, but that's also to make sure you don't increase the rate. We put a motion, and I'd like to see it before council discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Take that as direction to bring that to us at council. We have a motion for referral that's going to come up. I'd like to make some comments before that, but I'd also like first to for us to vote on the technical amendment, because I think regardless, this is purely a technical amendment. Can we carry that technical amendment? Thank you. So what we do refer to council, and the debate that does happen there will be done with the corrected numbers and motion. As the person who chaired that process, was at many of those public meetings and worked with councillors to find and staff very much so, to find a proposal through the rate review that we could vote on unanimously. I do recall on many occasions being very transparent that what we were talking about was how we divvy up the pie, and that the pie was the $42 million 2016 budget amount, that could not take a possible 2017, 18, 19, 20 amount and tell them what that might be, because we didn't know that at the time. But I also recall our staff being transparent that we have a long-range financial plan, it's updated regularly, and it does forecast significant increases in the rates for maintaining our water-related infrastructure. So I believe in that respect, as a council and our staff were transparent that it was not a promise that rates would stay fixed at a 2016 amount, but that we could not tell you how much it would be. However, it will be significant. We had been telegraphing that for quite a long time. That is the state of our water-related assets. I think it's also important to note that although we are presented these three sets of numbers, they aren't aligned or tied particularly, but rather they are presented together because they are a package, a water-related package. But it is certainly true, as has been noted by some councillors, that the stormwater amount is not related to the water consumption costs. They just happen to come forward at this time, and perhaps that helps to explain why they are quite different in amount. And in one case, it's significantly larger. The best forecasts of our staff as to what's going to be needed. So yes, they are presented together, but not as closely tied. Water and wastewater are very closely tied. Water in and water out from homes and businesses for whatever you used it. But that stormwater is not. So I did want to put all of that out there for context. I suppose we may have to do that again when we vote at council, because today we're really just voting on referral. Do we have a motion or referral ready? Or is it quite simply I'd like to move referral?
Move referral to council.
On referral, is that unanimous, or do we want to go for a vote? Okay, on what grounds do you move referral?
To, well, among other things, to address the issues raised by Councillor Moffat between now and the council meeting.
On those grounds then, motion for referral, is that carried? Okay, thank you very much. We now move to item 4. Got my numbers right. The 2016 Drinking Water Quality Management System Annual Management Review Report. I know a couple of councillors had questions, but I also know that there was something that our staff wanted to clarify through a brief presentation in advance. Yes, why don't you, as they are preparing, Councillor Shirley, Vice Chair Chiarelli will table a motion.
Okay, so it's moved by myself, whereas an error has been discovered on page 6 of report ACS 2017-PWEGEN-0029, dealing with raw water supply and drinking water quality trends, particularly as pertains to the nitrate concentration in groundwater wells in the Shadow Ridge well system. Therefore be it resolved, committee approve the substitution of the following sentence: nitrate concentrations have shown a gradual but steady increase from 1.5 milligrams per liter in 2008 to 5.1 in 2016 at the Shadow Ridge well system, with the following corrective version: nitrate concentrations have grown a gradual but steady increase from 1.5 in 2008 to 4.5 in 2016 at Shadow Ridge well system.
Thank you. And we will, of course, vote on that when we do on the acceptance of the main report. Over to our staff for presentation then, please.
There is no presentation prepared for today's item.
Sorry, I thought it was I thought in our conversation you wanted to correct some or give an update. Perhaps it was just in response to questions that you were prepared to do that. Okay.
Yes,
so I know Councillor Drews in particular wanted to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I really appreciate staff being here today to answer a few questions on a matter probably where it's raised in the last few days in our community, and I know probably I'm glad to see the correction in nitrate level. I just want to the context of the motion and what has been going on in the community. In the last 4 years, I remember in 2014 we received when we received the report, and we were advised the community and we advised the resident that we've seen the trend that it's been going on since 2012, I'm assuming now. There is any changes in the trend that we're really not expecting? Are we seeing higher jump, or we're going constantly with the expectation that we said to the resident is going?
Mr. Chair, we apologize. We didn't get a chance to translate the slide to French. But to answer Councillor DeRuza's question, here is the trend that we have for nitrates in drinking water at the Shadow Ridge well system. So since 2009, we've seen an increasing trend in those nitrates levels. Responding to Councillor DeRuza's question, there has been no significant change to the trend, so it continues to increase. And given the current trend, the top line that's dashed shows the regulatory limit for safe drinking water. So I think one of the key messages to take away is that the water in Shadow Ridge is very safe. So the quality is excellent, and there are no health concerns with the water in Shadow Ridge. If the continuing trend doesn't change, we expect that we could reach this regulatory limit in about a 12 to 15-year range. And currently, the city is exploring the option to go into the deeper aquifer where there are no nitrates in the source water. So that is the preferred approach to not to fix the issue, but to address the issue of nitrates.
Thank you, Tammy. I really appreciate it. I know you and I talk about that a lot. So if this trend continue, so let me, to set the record straight, before we see blue baby in Greeley and toxic water, we should have probably 12 to 15 years?
Yes, that's correct. So, and the city currently has plans to start the design work to deepen those wells in Shadow Ridge. So those new source wells will be in place well before we get near the drinking water standard.
Thank you. Can Mr. Brown give us a little update on where we are with the well and the design, like what to expect? I know you can't talk about the financial, but can we address the committee a little bit on give them a progress, what happened from last year to this year? Because I remember we talked about that in last Environment Committee.
Yes, so staff are going to be conducting a study to ensure that reviewing past reports and doing the engineering to determine the proper depth, make sure that it gets to an aquifer that is free of nitrates, and moving forward in a plan, hopefully within 2019, 2020, to actually drill the well to the deeper aquifer.
Thank you. Are we, like, when do you think we'll have a confirmative answer that we can go to the community and talk to them about? Because I remember we met with them last year, the year before, and we promised them going to come back and talk to them publicly to explain to them our plan and our schedule. So for time frame, do you think, do you have any time frame expectation that we go back to the community? Because the anxiety is very high, and I want to make sure that we're addressing every point. And also, can you give me a little bit background how we are here today, and is that through the planning process? And do we have, how many wells like those we have in the city? Are we addressing all the issues, or this is bigger problem? And how we end up here today with the Shadow Ridge 2?
So to your first question, Mr. Chair, with respect to timing of going back to the community, we'd be pleased to discuss with the ward councillor about setting up a meeting to go to the public. There are some details with respect to the financial situation, which there was an in-camera report that went to committee and council. but the details of that will be public hopefully in the very near future. So we'd be pleased to work with the ward councillor to conduct a public meeting to assure the community. With respect to your second question, which I believe was related to the development progress, the Shadow Ridge well is only used by about approximately 5% of the residents of Greeley. It's a communal well operated by the city, by Ms. Rose's group. It is still owned by the developer. All other development within the village of Greeley is on private well systems, which are the responsibility of the homeowner. The water quality metrics which water services are presenting are just strictly to the communal well, which is for the residents of Shadow Ridge, which I believe there are approximately 190 to 200 homes at this time. Further development within the Shadow Ridge development area is not progressing at this time. There has been a mediation session that was held to determine the future of development, but at this time there is no progress on that. And to your third question, I'll be honest, I'm not sure what it was.
My third question was like, how did we end up approving this?
Okay, so historically, Mr. Chair, that this development dates back into the late 90s, into the township days and the regional municipality days. It was approved under those guidelines, and it's still not built out after about 20 years since it was originally initiated.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for the benefit of this committee. I know there is some media outlet I wouldn't say irresponsible, but the title was of an article came out in the Metro last week on Friday about water toxic in Greeley, Ontario. That really sets lots of resident and lots of community association, and in specific, the resident that they live not only in the Shadow Ridge area, they live in the whole community as Greeley. There is 3,600 homes in Greeley, as Mr. Brown mentioned, that this is an isolated issue. This is only for one well that we service, community well, and was not even approved at the time of the city. So that was, I think we inherited that well back from amalgamation, and staff and I have been working since 2014. I don't want to take from them a lot. They've been working very hard with myself and the community on making sure we address all these issues that we inherited ourselves. And they've been working very professionally, and we are keeping our resident and community informed every step of the way. But sometimes a headline like this, it sends a wrong message, not only to the people who live in Shadow Ridge, to the whole people who live in Greeley, and they start bringing some other subdivision that to the equation, which is there is two separate issues. The communal well has nothing to do with private service well. Most of us who live in Greeley, we know how to service our well, and the quality of water is really, there is nothing wrong with it. And if there is maybe high nitrate or some deficiency, it's probably in the equipment or probably sometimes in the pipe. And I just want to emphasize on that, to making sure this report sends lots of anxiety to my community. And I will be sending a public letter to the editor, and I'm sure I want to ask staff if what we are doing for public, as a city, we are responsible to release some kind of statement or something to ensure that our property is not depreciation in Greeley. The anxiety, if people are going to Google right now that they want to move to Greeley, first thing they're going to see that is toxic in Greeley. And this is very strong, it's misleading headline, and I'm really opposing to it, and I'm really happy with it, as you know, myself and my community. So I'm asking staff what we are doing to help this anxiety and make a public statement to my community, to citywide, that to let people know that there is not people and there is no kids turning blue in Greeley, and that the water is safe to drink to the benefit of my resident.
And Chair, we're working with corporate communications on getting something out, hopefully, well, as soon as possible, hopefully today, and it will set the record straight on not just the water quality in Shadow Ridge, but also services where private well owners can also have their water tested if they're not aware of that as of yet.
Thank you, Kevin, and I really appreciate it, Mr. Chair, to give me the opportunity, because this is how sometimes couple word in the media, it changed the whole perception what's happening on the ground. I'm really disappointed, but I just want to bring this to the attention of the committee, and I will be sending the letter that I'm sending to Metro to this committee for your benefit and for staff, just to review it and to make sure that to know what's going on in Greeley. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
You're most welcome. Naturally, I would be as concerned as you, should my residents have read a headline like that and be under the fear of toxic water. So I'm glad that we were able to put on the record that that is not the case, and steps are being taken to ensure that there is a long-term solution. Councillor Brockton, you had a couple of questions.
What are the nitrate levels of water coming from the Britannia and Lemieux plants?
I don't have that information with me, but I can certainly provide that to committee.
Is it comparable, or are we seeing an increase at this particular well?
No, the Shadow Ridge is the only system where we're seeing nitrates at this level and the increasing trend. So we're not seeing that in any of our other
You said
systems.
the water that's being drawn now is completely safe?
What I'm saying is that the water quality in Shadow Ridge is completely safe to drink. There
Okay.
are no health concerns with the water quality in Shadow Ridge.
But when it hits 10, that is an unacceptable level.
That's correct.
And are there health impacts at that point?
Yes, there are health impacts, and the vulnerable population would be infants that are bottle fed.
So in addition to Councillor DeRuza's question about public notification to correct the record, have you informed folks that there is nitrate in the water?
So with the councillor's office a few years ago, we had a public meeting was held in the ward with the residents of Shadow Ridge to explain to them the increasing trends in nitrates and the plans that the city were forming to look after the issue.
So folks know, fully aware. You've talked about potentially building or going deeper to draw from a, let's just say, a cleaner source. Are you trying to understand what the source of the nitrates are? If it's a farming, I don't know if it's a community around it, but certainly nitrates from chemicals, manure, anything that can run in and seep into that aquifer water. Are we trying to target the source instead of digging a whole new aquifer?
Mr. Chair, there has been some review and study done in the area. Hydrogeology is a very, very complex science, and it's very difficult to determine a definitive source of the nitrates. The focus has been primarily on finding a solution to eliminate the nitrate contamination, and our hydrogeologist is very confident that going to the lower aquifer will eliminate that nitrate issue.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up on that. I know Councillor DeRuza is on this well, and I just wanted to make sure that everyone who's drinking water is fully aware of what's in it. You've said that's the case, so yeah. I'm satisfied.
Thank you. And just for your benefit, when we're talking between two aquifer, the first aquifer is around 80 feet down, and the next one will be 260 to 280. So there is a lots of difference in the level of the both wells.
All right, thank you. So on this item, is this report received? Yes, we need to vote on the amendment. We've lost our vice chair to read that, but we've received it on the amendment. That's carried. Okay, and the report is received. Thank you. Then quickly, any notices of motions? Seeing none. Inquiries. Councillor Leeper.
Thank you, Chair. Quick inquiry. On September 15th, Waste Watch Ottawa released a report asserting low rates of waste diversion in Ottawa. Could staff please provide its assessment of whether the quantitative facts on which that report are based are correct?
Okay, thank you. We'll receive that item. In closing, I do want to note that there has been a number of there has been media coverage, particularly on waste-related issues of note. Of course, the Waste Watch report release and everything from Bridgehead's coffee pods to others. I did want to put one fact out there, which I think is very important, and also draw attention. Kevin Wiley, General Manager, sent out a memo yesterday which gave more detail on this. The city has been anticipating the province's entirely new approach, the Waste-Free Ontario Act of 2016. 151. For a couple of years, we've known that's coming, and we've known that the approach that it's recommending is going to be significantly different from the approach that has been taken to waste management in municipalities across Ontario, and it was believed that major investments in changes in advance of something which was going to force significant changes on us made no sense. It would be far more logical and a better use of our money to be knowing what the new rules were going to be, and at that point make any significant changes. That's not to say that we stop doing anything. In fact, we have a major campaign underway right now for waste diversion out in the public and on buses. But for anyone who did not see that memo, it is publicly available, and we can certainly make sure others receive that. I thought that quite important to get on the record, and it turns out to be closely related to this inquiry. So, closing then, other business? Seeing none, adjournment? Thank you.